Good evening. I'm happy to be here virtually to speak with the CCBS. So I'm going to start off tonight's talk by discussing some of my current research involving density functional theory for molecular crystal structure prediction. I was also asked to talk about careers in academia. So in the second half of the talk, I had prepared some slides for consideration when applying to graduate school and looking for faculty positions. Since we have a pretty small audience tonight, maybe this can be a bit more of an informal discussion than a formal talk, but I'll begin with a research presentation. So my research group works in the area of theoretical and computational chemistry. Maybe some of you aren't very familiar with this as a discipline because most undergraduate chemistry deals with experimental work and you take a lot of labs in your undergraduate degree, but maybe you haven't seen computational work. So I want to let you know that this area of chemistry exists and is quite rich and interesting. So the aim of quantum chemistry is to be able to predict properties of molecules and solids from first principles. So from a fundamental mathematical description of the interactions between electrons and nuclei, we can compute energies of chemical systems and then compute experimentally observable properties. These include things like molecular geometries that you can obtain from, say, X-ray crystallography, thermodynamic quantities like enthalpies and free energies, kinetic properties like barrier heights and reaction rates, spectroscopic quantities such as molecular vibrations and NMR shieldings, and mechanical properties such as elastic constants. These are all things that we can compute, and we can perform calculations on isolated molecules, bulk solids, surfaces, and collections of molecules such as in solution. The fundamental tool that we use primarily in quantum chemistry is density functional theory. The basis here is that if we have a knowledge of the electron density, which is the 3D electron distribution, then from that we can compute the energy and all the observable properties of interest. So we have the density describing the electron distribution around an atom or in a molecule, such as benzene, as shown here. From that 3D distribution, electron density is a function of x, y, z position in space. We can then compute the energy as a function of a function of the electron density. So density functional theory is based on this, and it's incredibly widely used. This is really the workhorse in quantum chemistry that's used by researchers around the world, and many of the most cited papers in all areas of science, not just chemistry, are related to density functional theory. The reason this is so widely used is because density functional theory is very accurate for describing intramolecular interactions that can be widely used to model reactions and properties of network solids. The problem with DFT is that there are some situations in which it can break down, and until a couple decades ago, one of these situations was for weak London dispersion interactions. London dispersion is responsible for condensation of nonpolar molecules like hydrocarbons and also for noble gases. So what we have here is a diagram that you would have seen in your first year chemistry class describing London dispersion. So at any given instant, you can have an instantaneous dipole moment in the electron distribution about an atom or molecule, and that can induce instantaneous dipole moments in the distribution of a neighboring atom or molecule. And the interaction between these dipole moments can give you a weak attractive force. The strength of these dispersion interactions is going to increase with the polarizability. The more polarizable the molecule, the larger these instantaneous dipole moments. So this can explain boiling point trends with, for example, heavier hydrocarbons having greater dispersion, stabilization, and hence higher boiling points. Because this is a highly long-range, non-local interaction, it's simply not captured by most common density functionals that are just using the electron density around points in space. So we needed to add dispersion corrections to DFT to be able to apply it to intermolecular chemistry as well as intramolecular chemistry. So dispersion interactions, while being quite weak in strength, are ubiquitous in chemistry and collectively can be very important. So dispersion interactions determine the three-dimensional structure of biomolecules such as proteins and DNA. They determine molecular self-assembly. They control the properties of layered materials, as we'll see in a moment. They're important for molecular surface absorption, for phase transitions, such as melting and boiling, and determining crystal packing, which will be the subject of the second half of this talk. So here's an example showing the importance of dispersion for graphite. Graphite is kind of the classic example of a solid where the interactions are governed by dispersion. Graphite, as you know, is a layered material, and the interlayer interactions are determined by dispersion. So what I'm showing here is a potential energy curve for pulling the layers apart. We call this the exfoliation of graphite. So if you have a density functional without a dispersion correction, what you're going to get is this yellow line here that shows an entirely repulsive potential. You're not going to bind the layers of graphite if you don't have dispersion. And dispersion is an attractive interaction shown by the green curve. And when you add the repulsion and the dispersion contributions together, you get a nice potential energy curve with a well-defined minimum. This looks like the classic Leonard-Jones type 612 potential that you'd expect. So we need to add these dispersion terms to DFT methods. There's a number of dispersion corrections in the literature, but many are based on perturbation theory. So if you've taken a third-year quantum class, you may have already seen perturbation theory. And the way we model this is with that classic first-year chemistry picture, that we have dispersion arising from the interaction of instantaneous dipole moments. So you have an instantaneous dipole moment here, an instantaneous dipole moment here, and your perturbation is the interaction between them. Except that for a really accurate model of dispersion, you need to go beyond dipole moments and include things like quadrupoles. Anyway, with this dispersion formula, we can work out the dispersion energy. It involves a leading order C6 over R to the 6th term, like in the Leonard-Jones potential, as well as higher order terms that come from the higher order multiples. And it's the sum over all atom pairs in the system. We also have these van der Waals radii in the denominators to avoid this expression diverging as nuclei get close together. The particular dispersion method that we use in my group is called the exchange hole dipole moment, or the XDM dispersion method. And the nice thing about XDM is that it accounts for dependence of the dispersion coefficients, the CNs that we had on chemical environment. So we would have a different set of dispersion coefficients for a carbon atom that was sp3, say in methane, versus a carbon atom that was sp2 or sp. We also would have changes with charge state and coordination, which can be particularly important for transition metals if you're looking at a transition metal in a coordination complex. These dispersion coefficients are non-empirical, and they're determined from properties of the electron density. So if we're computing our density anyway in DFT, we can use that density to evaluate our dispersion coefficients. The XDM model is highly accurate across a diverse set of chemistry problems. You can look at it for molecular dimers, molecular crystals, layered materials, and also surface absorption, all with one method without having to change it in any way. So as a result of this, we can do a lot with XDM. XDM is our tool that we can apply to a range of applications. So unlike in a lot of experimental groups, we're not focused on one particular area of chemistry. We use one set of tools and then can apply them to all areas of chemistry. So I wanted to quickly show a few things you can do with computational chemistry. The first, what we often do in collaboration with experimentalists, is to do computational studies of reaction mechanisms. So for development of catalysts, you need to know the mechanism, and you ultimately want to tune a catalyst to minimize barriers for the rate limiting steps of a reaction. So with DFT, we can model the intermediates and transition states along a reaction pathway to aim to determine the mechanism and to modify ligands to get the best performance for a catalyst, as shown for an example here. Another area that we're interested in is modeling interactions of layered materials with surfaces. So this is an important problem in manufacture of devices. So in your electronic devices, you typically have semiconductors, such as a transition metal dichalcogenide, MOS2, and those form contacts with conductors, metals, into which you can have electric current. So we'd like to have transport of charge from the metal to the semiconductor. And this can be pretty challenging because if you just have a metal semiconductor, there's not a good way to get the charge across that gap due to the fact that the semiconductor has a band gap. So we can have a barrier to inject charge. So in the top plot here, the barrier to get the charge from the gold to the MOS2 is this barrier here shown in red. If we can add a material at the interface between the metal and the semiconductor, in this case, the material we're adding is dicalcium nitride, Ca2N, we can transfer charge from the Ca2N to effectively dope the semiconductor and lower its bands to have a better transfer of charge from the metal. And in this lower plot, the new barriers here are very much smaller, so we can easily transfer charge across this interface. So this is another type of problem that we can model with DFT using similar methods to the catalysis modeling, even though it's a very different type of chemistry problem. The last application is a big focus in my group, and that's crystal structure prediction. So first principles crystal structure prediction is a major challenge in chemistry. The idea here is to go from a 2D chemical diagram of a molecule and predict the three-dimensional crystal packing. Now, you can imagine there's a lot of different ways that molecules can pack to form a solid, and these different packing arrangements, which are called polymorphs, can have different properties. For example, they would have different sublimation energies and different melting points, and this translates also into differences in solubility. The differences in solubility are important in biology, in that if you have a drug that is in a form that's more soluble, then you can get more of it into solution, it will be more bioavailable. Whereas if you have a polymorph that's more stable and less soluble, the drug will be less bioavailable. So it's a major problem for pharmaceutical companies when developing a new drug to screen all of the potential polymorphs. Now, trying to do this computationally is a major problem because CSP requires extensive structure generation to generate all the possible packings, and also very accurate energy ranking to determine which of those packings is the most stable and hence the one most likely to be seen experimentally. Right, so I'm going to show a few examples of this. The first is for organic electronic material. So this was our first foray into CSP, and it was done in collaboration with the group at Imperial that had made this 1-aza-6-helicene molecule. And depending on the packing of this molecule, whether you have a single enantiomer in a crystal or whether you have a racemic mixture of the two enantiomers, you have very different charge mobility. So the racemic form has a much greater charge mobility and would be much more useful in organic electronics than the enantiopure form. So we performed a set of calculations to generate this plot of energy versus density for the material. This is what we call a crystal energy landscape. So points that are lower in energy on this plot are the more likely forms to be seen experimentally. So here, for this material, we performed DFT calculations and predicted this form is the most stable, a racemic form, and that matched the experimental crystal structure. We also predicted an enantiopure form to be higher in energy than the racemate, and that matched experiment, and our relative energy difference between these forms was also in good agreement with the experimental ordering. We also applied CSP methods to a couple of pharmaceuticals. The first of these is 4-fluorouracil, which is used in anti-cancer treatments. This material has two different polymorphs, forms 1 and form 2, which we identified to be the two lowest forms in our energy landscape. And again, we get the correct ordering with form 1 actually more stable than form 2 experimentally. Finally, the example is olanzapine, where there's 3 known forms experimentally and a 4th that's seen, but the crystal structure for it hasn't been solved. So we only have a proposed crystal structure. Again, our computational methodology is working very well, where we can predict these 4 forms as the most stable in our landscape. And again, we recover the right energy ordering, with form 1 being the most stable of the 4 experimentally. So this methodology is working very well. The problem is doing DFT calculations like this for CSP is very computationally expensive. So we need to have an efficient workflow so that we can do this in reasonable amounts of computer time. So the way that CSP is done, it's typically a multi-level refinement. You start off with what's known as a force field, something that just uses classical mechanics and not any electronic structure calculations to generate the initial structures and come up with an initial energy ranking. But force fields, because they're just dependent on point charges, are not very accurate. So we might need to carry forward thousands of force field structures to ensure that we're including the experimental structure. And it's just not practical to do full DFT calculations, optimizing the crystal structures of thousands of candidates. So to be able to do these calculations in a reasonable amount of time, we need to somehow screen the thousands of candidates and identify the most promising targets for full DFT optimization. So the way we do this is we just take the force field structures and we perform DFT energy evaluations only, not changing the crystal structure in any way. So we can compute the energies, which is fast, and then take the ones with just the lowest energies as the most promising candidates, identify maybe 10, 100, a couple hundred if we need to, structures, and then use those for full DFT geometry optimization to ideally identify the most stable polymorphs. So this is the methodology we're proposing and using going forward. So our current challenge is the 7th CSP blind test. So these are competitions that are organized by the Cambridge Crystallographic Data Center, the CCDC. And every few years, the CCDC will collect crystal structures of compounds that haven't yet been published and hold these in reserve. They'll then distribute a list of the chemical structures to participants, and they will have a certain amount of time to submit their predictions of the crystal structure back to the CCDC. So the 7th blind test is currently underway. We recently participated in the first round where we predicted the structure of this molecule shown here. And we're waiting to hear back if we happen to get that one right. And we're also waiting for the second round to start at the end of the month, where we're going to get lists of potential crystal structures for these other 5 compounds. And we'll have about 6 months to do the energy ranking and predict which of the candidate structures they give us is actually going to be a soluble form experimentally. So we're hoping we can do well in that come the summer. All right, so that's it for the description of my research. I'd just like to end thanking my current and former group members, as well as some of my collaborators. And at this point, I think we can pause here, and I'd be happy to take any research questions before getting into some of the career discussion afterwards. So, questions?
Let's take a look here. If anyone wants to do questions, they can either enter them into the chat or they can unmute themselves, and they can also say it that way as well. I actually had a question myself. The research that you're doing with like your own work and stuff, how many like opportunities do you have to give to like some undergrad or like master students? Like, or was it all done by like, I can see over here, a lot of them are just like, either they're working at like their PhD students, or they're like already working like in the universities. Like, how many of these opportunities are actually presentable
Okay, yeah,
in your lab?
that's a good question. So I tend to have mostly graduate students, but I have some undergraduate students. So currently in my group, I have 2 undergrads, Adrian and Grace, that are doing their honors projects with me. Adrian also worked with me in the summer. A couple of my current graduate students, Alistair Price and Joe Weatherby, had previously worked with me as undergrads. Alistair did his honors with me, and Joe did a NSERC USRA a few summers ago. So there's definitely undergraduate opportunities. I tend to take only students that have had a previous quantum class, because it helps to have seen some quantum before starting. So typically I only have students that are starting in my group after their third year. I don't take students between their first and second, or second and third year. But that's more unique to theory. And if I had a really promising student that was really keen, that had done some second year work and was willing to put in a lot of work and learn the coding, I would consider it. A lot of experimental groups do take students between their first and second year, or second and third year law. It's more theory that requires the quantum first.
And for these students to get involved, did they just come up to you and ask, or is there like an application process? Did they have to get like their own scholarship to work?
So usually undergraduate students apply to the NSERC USRA program to try and get some funding. So there's a call out for that every year. And the way USRA works, you, at least at Dell, interested students contact the program coordinator, and then there's a form they have to take around, and you have to meet with 3 different faculty members. So you should approach the professor directly and say that you're interested in working in your group. There's also, and I was actually going to mention this later, other ways to get involved with undergraduate research. A great one is the co-op program. If you have a co-op program, you can do a co-op placement in a research group. There's also mechanisms for undergrads to do research at different universities than their home university through something called, for inorganic chemistry, the Inorganic Chemistry Exchange. So that's something you could look into. And if maybe you don't have the marks to get one of the NSERC USRAs, but you can always go up to a professor and engage with them and see if they'd be interested in taking you on, either as a summer student in a paid position, or maybe an unpaid volunteer position if they don't have much grant money, but you're still interested in doing some research in the lab.
That's very interesting. And you mentioned coding and like knowledge in quantum. I'm assuming that that's what they'd be kind of doing at a very low level, just kind of like the grunt work.
So a knowledge of quantum is not, it's not 100% necessary to do computational chemistry, but it definitely helps to understand what the methods are doing. You don't need to do coding to do computational chemistry. A lot of graduate students do coding projects, but that's typically more advanced stuff. For a student just getting into computational chemistry, you're typically not doing any coding. You're more just running software, running calculations. Although you would want to know Linux and command line to do computational chemistry specifically. So we use Compute Canada clusters, which are supercomputing clusters. So if you're going to do those, it's all Linux based. So if you're interested in computational chemistry, it's great if you can learn a bit of Linux and become comfortable with the command line. That's a great skill to start out with.
Sounds good. So a little bit of like computer science in there too, I guess. All right, cool. Thank you so much.
All right, so maybe I'll advance to some of what I was going to say about graduate school then. Guys, at this point, I just thought we could have a more casual dialogue. So if anybody has any questions, please just unmute and jump in. This is not going to be as much of a formal presentation as the research talk. So maybe you're thinking about whether you want to go to graduate school. Should you go to graduate school? So I wanted to talk a bit about what you should do to prepare and apply for graduate studies. So if you're interested in research jobs in industry, if you're interested in being a lecturer or if you're interested in becoming a faculty member, all of these require more than just an undergraduate degree. So you would want to do graduate studies to gain the necessary experience. There's two types of graduate programs. There's MSc degrees, a master's, or PhD degrees, a doctorate. MSc is typically 2 years, but it can sometimes stretch to 3. PhD is typically 4 to 5 years. When you're applying to graduate school, you always apply to a master's program to start. That doesn't mean you have to get a master's. The way it typically works is if you're interested in getting a PhD, you'd start in the master's, but at around the 18-month mark, you would pass what's called a preliminary or qualifying exam. It's like an oral defense. And if you pass the qualifying, then you're advanced or transfer into the PhD program. And starting in the MSc then allows you the flexibility to decide partway through, maybe you only want a master's or maybe you want to transfer to the PhD. So you have that option. You can also complete a master's with one supervisor at one university and then start a PhD program with a different supervisor and be at a different university. So that can also be common if you start in a particular area of research which you think you're really going to like, and then maybe you don't. So maybe you start doing synthetic work and then decide, well, this isn't for me. I think I'd rather do something more mechanistic, or you just want to try different areas so you can switch from one degree, finish a master's, and then go on to a PhD somewhere else. Master's can be good enough for some industry jobs if you're just interested in working as like a benchtop chemist or doing some coding projects, things like that. But if you want to become a professor or a group leader in industry to direct research, then you really need a PhD. When you're thinking about applying to PhD programs, it's important that you apply to a professor, not a university. So don't just think, oh, I really want to move to a particular city, I'm going to apply to the university there, send your application to the chemistry department and leave it. If you do that, you're not going to get in. You need to have a particular professor that's going to pick your application out of the pile. And the way that happens is that you have to approach them personally through email and then have a discussion about research. And then if that seems to be a good match, you can be accepted by the professor into their group. So you need to give some thought to which professors to approach as potential advisors. So some good ways to do that is to talk to your current professors and TAs. So your TAs are graduate students who are doing their own research. And if you find you enjoying a particular lab or a particular area of chemistry, you can talk to a TA for that class. You can talk to your professor. You can say, oh, I'm really interested in this area of research. I think I'd like to do that for graduate school. You can potentially work with that professor, or they can suggest names of professors at other universities in that area. Another thing I'd highly recommend is to look through online faculty pages. Most faculty will have a website that has a description of their group's research, as well as a lot of contact information and links to their papers and things. So you can look through and find professors whose research is really interesting to you personally and find what excites you. Another trick I'd recommend is to try and attend departmental seminars or local conferences. This is actually a lot easier in recent years due to the shift to online seminars and conferences, so you don't necessarily have to travel to attend. So if you can tune into seminars or conferences, you can hear some research talks, and again, find someone who is giving an interesting talk about chemistry that excites you. For Ontario, there's the Southern Ontario Undergraduate Student Conference. There's also national meetings like the Canadian Society for Chemistry's national meeting. So you can attend some of these. A lot of subject areas have online seminar series now, like the Inorganic Discussion. Used to be the Inorganic Discussion Weekend. Now there's an online set of inorganic seminar talks. The CSC has a physical division for physical and theoretical that has online seminar series. So you can look for these and see if you can find something that interests you. again, I can't stress enough, you need to contact professors directly via personalized email. Don't just send a form letter that you blast to every faculty member in a department. I don't know how many of those I get, and they're just completely impersonal. You need to say something in it, address it personally to the professor, say something about you've read some of their work, have seen them give a talk, you've looked at their website, say that you think what you find interesting about their research, maybe something you'd like to work on. Ideally, send them a copy of your CV if you have one. And then if you have something personal in there, they'll be much more likely to respond to your email. It might be that they just don't have funding or spots available in their group, and they'll send you a polite negative response. But if there's potential spots in their group, they'll probably send you an email back arranging for a Zoom or Skype call for discussion about your research, and then go from there. So you really need to have that personal email. I also want to stress, do this early. Don't wait. You should start contacting professors in the summer or fall before you're going into your fourth year of study, your final year of study. So if you're thinking of graduating this year and going to grad school next year, now is the time you should definitely be emailing faculty. If you wait into the winter, all the fellowship deadlines will have passed, and that can be a problem, because if a faculty member doesn't have much grant money available, they're not able to take on students without fellowships. If students get fellowships, that gives the student more money, but it also saves the faculty member some money. So applying before the fellowship deadline is really important. And then my last tip for this is to contact graduate students in the group of a potential advisor. And this is important to get inside information. You want to get a sense from someone in the group how that professor is an advisor. Professors and people have very different supervisory styles. So you can have some advisors that are very hands-on, others that are very hands-off. So you want to find out how that faculty member behaves to their students and if it's going to be a good fit with your working style. So you definitely want to contact students to get inside information. And sometimes you can be warned off if there's a lot of friction in the group between the students and the advisor. So definitely take that seriously. Oh, I see something in the chat. Have I ever accepted any PhD students before? Sure, I have a bunch of PhD students in my group. So I've definitely accepted PhD students, and they've typically all emailed me in the way that we discussed, or it's been students that I've had previously as undergrads that have stuck around for PhD. Other questions related to that? Actually, any questions related to what I've talked about here, please go ahead.
I've heard I've heard about going straight into your PhD after your undergrad, and there's some like things of talking about that. Not really sure. No one really talked about it too much, but I did hear from some people that is a possibility where people just straight skip their masters. Have you ever seen that before? Do you have any advice for anyone who's thinking of that as an option?
Yeah, it's some universities let you do a direct entry to PhD. And that sometimes can be good in that if you do a direct entry, it can potentially reduce the number of courses you have to take in your graduate degree. The caution there is then there's sort of no out. So if you do go directly into PhD, you need to be really confident that you're going to want to stay at that university with that advisor for a PhD. Because there's always the potential. It's a long program. I mean, it's 4 or 5 years can be a slog. You need to be really self-motivated. So if you go into a PhD and then 2 years in, you're just thinking, geez, I made a mistake. I'm not interested in this anymore. I don't want to do this. I'm not getting on with my advisor, any of those things. If you've done the direct entry to PhD, then there's sort of no escape route. Whereas if you start with the master's, it's easy to advance the PhD. And then, but if it's not working, there's an easy out in that you get your master's degree. So that's the thing you need to look out for. But yeah, direct entry to PhD is definitely possible at a lot of universities. It's just pretty rarely done.
And so you just have to make sure that you get along with your actual supervisor, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because it's gonna be like what, 4 years of just sticking together throughout
Yeah,
the whole thing. Okay,
yeah.
I see.
I
That
mean,
makes a lot of
your
sense.
PhD advisor really is your academic family, that research group. So your advisor is like your academic parent, and your lab mates are your academic siblings. And there's actually these academic family trees where you can trace this back. So it's a long-term relationship, and you're reliant on your PhD advisor and forever afterwards for things like letters of recommendation. So you want to make sure that you have a good relationship with this person, and they're going to be a good mentor to you going forward. Other
All right,
questions?
yeah, does anyone have any other questions, Dr. Johnson?
I have some more stuff, if not. So this is kind of what I had mentioned before. So what experience is beneficial for going to graduate school? So previous undergraduate research experience is definitely beneficial. So if you're thinking about potentially going to research, you're not sure if this is right for you, or you want to see which area of chemistry research is most interesting, you should definitely consider trying to gain some undergraduate experience. So you can do this through the NSERC USRA program that I mentioned earlier. I know Carleton's very active in trying to get USRA fellowships for students, so you should definitely talk with your professors about that. As I said, check out the co-op program. That can be another mechanism where you can get research experience for course credit. Check out exchange programs. I know the Inorganic Chemistry Exchange is one. There may be others in different areas of chemistry. And then, of course, there's your honors research. So if you're doing an honors degree, you would have what used to be your 498 project. I guess now it's 4908. That gives you the kind of capstone project on your degree where you do research for the full year and write an honors thesis. And finally, there's opportunities potentially to volunteer in research groups over the summer or during the term. So having significant undergraduate research experience is definitely going to look good when you're applying to graduate studies, and will really help you get fellowship funding and awards. The other 2 points here are more targeted to theory, but they're still useful in other areas of chemistry. And the first is to work on your technical writing. I found consistently people joining my group as graduate students have pretty weak technical writing skills, and a surprising amount of your time as a graduate student or a faculty member is spent with writing, because we communicate our scientific results through peer-reviewed publications. And for your honors, for your master's, for your PhD, you have to write a thesis. As a faculty member, you need to write research grants. So technical writing is really a critical part of academic work in chemistry. So it's important to learn rules governing grammar and sentence structure. That might sound kind of dull or kind of, but it's really very useful. And that's something that you can brush up on through writing your lab reports, through writing your honors thesis, that will really save you a tremendous amount of time in graduate school. If you're a good technical writer, you'll get through writing your thesis in a small fraction of the time than if you're not. I would also suggest learning to use some common software. The Microsoft Office suite is common, but it's not what we typically use, particularly in theoretical and computational chemistry for a lot of our work. The LaTeX, LaTeX is a great way to prepare documents for scientific papers, and particularly for theses. So if you're going to write a thesis in Word, it's going to be long, it's going to eat up all the memory, it's going to have problems saving. When you references are picky, when you insert a graphic, just everything moves all around. So if you do LaTeX, then you don't have any of those problems. It's much easier to use. And if someone comes back and wants a format change to your thesis, you can take care of it easily with changing one line in your document, as opposed to struggling with reformatting the whole thing. So if you're interested in learning LaTeX, You can Google Overleaf, check out Overleaf as a nice interface to learning LaTeX, and that can be a great thing to do to use for your lab reports and your honors thesis to save you a lot of time. ChemDraw is more important in the experimental side than in theory, but learning ChemDraw can be great to sketch out mechanisms, and that can be a great skill for starting grad school. And the last one is scientific plotting programs. So Excel makes not great looking plots. If you want to have pretty plots for a scientific paper or for a thesis, you probably want to use something else. In my group, I like NuPlot, but there's a lot of other scientific plotting programs out there, so that can be something you can play around with. Of course, for computational chemistry, as I mentioned, there's Linux and learning the command line. But the rest of these are a bit more transferable to other areas. Questions on this? Would RStudio be a useful program to know? I have no idea. I've never used R myself. I think that's used a lot for statistics, but I'm not 100% certain. So yeah, I don't know.
In terms of like the technical writing, when you were seeing your graduate students like trickle into your group, like was it things like that you believed were like common sense that we should know, or was it like something oddly specific?
Oh no, just things that I think that everyone should know if they've done any technical writing at all. I mean, there's just so many issues I see with writing. I spend such large amounts of my time correcting other people's grammar. I mean, it's really interesting, but the students that I've had, the graduate students I've had that have been best with English writing have all had English as a second language. I think when you learn English as a second language, you're taught a lot of grammar rules. Whereas people that grew up in Canada and had English as their first language and went through the Ontario or the Nova Scotia high school systems just never really learned proper grammar rules and technical writing. You know, they do a lot of creative writing, but the teachers wouldn't enforce grammar because that was somehow hampering creativity. So then you get these, you know, sentences that just don't obey any grammar rules, and writing that's almost like a stream of consciousness with minimal punctuation. And, you know, it can be really hard to try and teach grammar rules to graduate students. It's something I continually work on. And, you know, anytime anyone's writing a draft of a paper or a thesis, we'll have many drafts and iterations of revisions. So, you know, grammar and technical writing is really an important skill that's not given enough emphasis, I don't think.
And so like if you take a look at like, you know, the common softwares that you're looking at right now and you see them like on somebody's resume, or like for example, they say that like, oh yeah, I know how to use Mo and all these other softwares that you're kind of learning about like now. Would you see that as like a sort of an asset that you'd actively seek out, or?
Yeah, I definitely would look through, and if people know how to use software that is used in my group, that's definitely a bonus when trying to look for graduate students to take on. You know, if I see somebody that's used Gaussian before, or has used Quantum Espresso, which is another program we used before, or has experience with Linux, or experience with Fortran programming, or experience with LaTeX, I'm going to be keen to have that person a lot more than if I see somebody with Microsoft Office. So having some of these skills definitely helps.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean it's not often going to make or break an application, but it helps. You know, if you have a couple of people applying to your group and you can only take one, and one person has a lot of experience with computational chemistry already and the other person doesn't, well, obviously you're going to go with the person with more experience. So putting these sorts of skills on your CV or your resume can really help.
Did you start gaining research experience like early on in your undergraduate career? Like when did you start with that?
Yeah, actually, I got into research really early, and I worked throughout my undergraduate degree. So I was getting undergraduate research experience practically right from the start. But that's more unusual. Um, it, but you should try and get involved as early as you can. It's never hurts to go up to one of your professors and ask if they have any research opportunities available in their lab. Research is a lot of fun and just fascinating to do. So the sooner you get involved in research, the better, both for your career path, but also just for maintaining interest in chemistry.
Yeah, I was gonna say that because a lot of us here that are here are in biochemistry and chemistry, right? Um, so that means that a lot of us are either thinking of going into a professional school, thinking of going to research, or like eventually being a professor like yourself, or maybe getting like a government job. In your opinion, do you think it's advisable for us to try to get some work experience with our undergraduate degrees, or goes try to apply for a master's straight after our undergraduate degree?
Well, if you're interested in an academic career, definitely go to grad school right after your undergraduate degree. For a professional school, like if you're interested in medical school, I don't have any experience with that myself, so I don't know what they're looking for. But for if you're interested in working in industry, working as a instructor, working as a professor, um, then I would suggest going right to grad school after undergrad and not having a gap.
Okay, I see. Because I know that some industries, or like sometimes when you're working with the government and stuff, after your undergrad, if they like you, you work for them for a couple of years. Sometimes they offer to pay for your master's degree, or sometimes they offer to pay for
Well,
part of your schooling.
I mean, for
Um,
that's probably for like a professional master's. For a master's or PhD degree in science, it's research based. You don't pay, you get paid. So um,
oh, I see. Yeah.
if you're doing a master's or PhD in chemistry or biochemistry research, you're actually paid a stipend by your advisor or through your fellowships. So say you get an NSERC fellowship, your advisor would give you some stipend money as well. You don't actually pay tuition. I mean, technically you do, but that's behind the scenes. So your tuition is taken off your fellowship and stipend, and you get a paycheck every month. So you're actually paid to do research as a graduate student.
Oh, that's actually very interesting. I did not know too much about that. So,
Yeah, so it's like a job. I mean, it's a job, but it's a degree at the same time. You also get more money to TA. So TA is usually a requirement for the first couple of years of your graduate program. And if you don't like TAing, you can stop. But if you like TAing, you can keep TAing, and you can get paid to do that as well to supplement your income.
does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Johnson?
If not, I will finish one more thing, which I had wanted to mention, and that's what does a faculty member do all day? So if you're interested in potentially becoming a professor yourself, you can look at your professors now and say, hey, that job doesn't sound so bad. I wouldn't mind trying to do that. I wanted to highlight a bit about all the aspects of the job of a faculty member. So as a professor, your work is typically divided into research, teaching, and service. So research is, of course, designing, directing, and conducting research projects. A key part of this is mentoring your graduate students, your undergraduate researchers, and postdocs in your group. Writing and publishing scientific papers. You always hear about publish or perish. You need to write up and publish your results to get recognition and show that your group is being productive. And you want to present your research work at national and international conferences and invited seminars. There's actually quite a lot of opportunities to travel as a professor. So if you like travel, you can go to quite a few conferences a year and seminar trips. And if you don't like travel, then it can be a lot harder being a faculty member, because if you don't go to some of these conferences, it's harder to be visible in your field. So you can go to quite a lot of exotic places if that interests you. Teaching, of course, that's where you as undergrads would see your professors. So the typical course load is you teach 2 courses per year, 1 per semester. It's pretty standard. Although if you were at a small undergraduate school that's not research intensive, but is just more teaching, then you would have a heavier course load and less research. And the last part is service. There's a lot of components to service, serving on departmental and university committees, but also reviewing scientific papers, organizing conference sessions, and reviewing things like grant proposals. So you end up doing a lot of different things as a professor. It's a nice job in that you can manage your time as you like. So you can kind of keep your own hours, work when you want, get some travel in. But the frustration with that at the same time is it's not a 9-to-5 job. You're kind of in a way always working because you're always thinking about your research programs, or if your grad students need something, you need to be responsive to them. So you can easily take time off, but it's not a regular hours kind of job. So any questions about that?
Where have you gone? Where has like your work taken you in terms of like travel?
I've pretty much only been to places in Canada, the States, and Europe. So I've been to most of the major Canadian cities, a lot of cities in the States, Hawaii for Pacific Chem, which was nice. And then various places in Europe, England, France, Spain, Germany, Belgium, things like that.
And all through it, it's like out of your pocket, or is it like from the university?
No, it's paid for through your research grants. So typically when you get a research grant to run your group, part of that is for travel for you and your graduate students. So I try and take my group to attend things like the Canadian Society for Chemistry meeting, or next year there's the World Association of Theoretical and Computational Chemists, which is a big conference. It's going to be in Vancouver, so I'm going to try and take some of my graduate students to that. For the more exotic trips, it's too expensive to take your whole group. You might send one graduate student or go yourself if it's a big meeting in Europe or something. But for ones in Canada, it's usually good that you can bring several of your grad students and go as a group. So if you guys do decide to go to grad school, you should definitely ask your advisor if you can go to a conference or two.
Yeah, that sounds like a very enticing offer.
Yeah, and as graduate students, your travel costs would be paid. There's usually some travel funding available for graduate students from the university, and your advisor would pay the difference from their research grant. So that's covered travel. And what you can do is, if you've gone somewhere for a conference, then you can take like a few days to go play tourist, and that's on your own dime. But once the flight's been covered, it's not so bad to take a few days as a vacation as well.
So are the conferences you attend like pretty broad in terms of chemistry research, or do you go to one specifically for computational?
Both. So I go to some very broad ones. There's the Canadian Society for Chemistry, or the American Chemical Society. are broad meetings that cover all disciplines of chemistry. Whereas there's more specialized meetings that are just on theoretical and computational chemistry. And then there's even more specialized ones where you can have a small workshop with maybe 40 or 60 people just on a particular subfield, some aspect of theoretical chemistry that's an outstanding problem. So there's all kinds of scales, and they're useful for very different reasons. The workshops are great to work with the people directly in your subfield, and you can have very specialized discussions on outstanding problems. Those can be incredibly useful. But the big national chemistry conferences are also very useful in that you can find collaborators in different areas and then start potential research projects there. For example, with a theorist and experimentalist, or two experimentalists that use very different techniques could form a collaboration.
And you said these conferences usually happen like once a year, something like that, or like?
Yeah, the different conference series, some of them are annual. Some of them are every 2 years, some of them are every 3 years or every 5 years. So they all kind of run on different schedules. So you can find that some years there's like 3 or 4 conferences that you want to go to that are all interesting, and other years there might just be one. So they kind of come in bunches. I always say it never rains, but it pours. But yeah, the big ones, the national ones, are every year. The ACS is actually twice a year. That's the American Chemical Society. And then something like WATOC, the theoretical and computational one, is every 3 years.
And normally you said it was about, you go to about 1 or 2 per year.
Yeah, typically for faculty, they would go to more than that if they can. If you have the funding available, and you get invited to these things. So if you get a lot of invitations one year, you might go to more than that. So maybe 3 or 4 for a faculty member. For a graduate student, you'd probably go to 1 or 2 maximum per year.
That's still pretty sweet deal, I'm not gonna lie. So that's actually very interesting. Okay, cool. Well, if no one else has a question for Dr. Johnson, you said this was your last slide, correct?
Yes, I'm gonna stop here. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. I think this is also our time. If no one else has any questions or comments or concerns, anything that Dr. Johnson could address, I think now's a good time to stop the recording and then go into our giveaway, and then we'll break for the night. So thanks so much, Dr. Johnson. I don't know if you have someplace to be or anything like that, but we definitely really appreciate it. I know it's the time gap's a little bit ahead for you, so it's getting late, but we really do appreciate having you speak, especially from a Carleton alumni.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to do it.
Thanks so much. Okay, so, Eman, if you have the any of the sheets ready, so we can do our spin.
Yep, just making sure I have everyone's names.
Perfect. I'll also give you the sharing screen capabilities.